Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am honored to have Fred Beuttler here. He has deep experience with the Great Books program. He has, I will have him tell you the full story of it, but he's at university, he's worked at the University of Chicago. He has actually administered the program. He's not only gone through the program, but also administered the program as the dean. So this is a very rare opportunity. Great Books project is very close to my heart. I came here as an immigrant from India. And when I decided that I needed to study everything about this culture, this project was, indispensable, especially the Syntopicon, which in this meetup, I started my meetups. My meetup's original name was 103 Great Ideas based on the Syntopicon, and we covered almost 60 of those ideas in the meetup. So we have a long history with this. So I am just tremendously delighted and honored to have Fred here. Welcome, Fred.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. So Fred, how did you get interested in great ideas, philosophy? What's your background? Where did you grow up? How did you get interested in ideas in the first place?
Oh, that's a big question to start off with. Yes, thank you. And thank you, Shrikant, for having me on the show, on the meetup group. And I'm very excited and very impressed that you worked the way through many of the ideas in the Syntopicon. Sort of my background, I came to the University of Chicago as a graduate student way back in the late 1980s. And one of the things I wanted to prepare myself was in intellectual history, looking in many ways at the mid-20th century. I had heard about Robert Maynard Hutchins and Mortimer Adler, and I did a dissertation in that area, middle third of the 20th century, looking at the relationship between science, philosophy, religion, and democracy. And one of the people who was centered, or at least at the beginning of the work I was doing, was Mortimer Adler himself. And it was interesting as I've been watching and looking and examining much further his career, to find myself, really in 2015, applying for a job as associate dean at the Graham School. The Graham School the full title is the University of Chicago's Graham School for Continuing Liberal and Professional Studies. And in 2015, I became the associate dean there. And one of the things that I oversaw was what the Great Books movement evolved into. And that was a program that is now called the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults, which is not the best name because it's not at all a sort of basic education, but rather it's a 4-year curriculum focused on the great books that Mortimer Adler started back in 1946. And so this year is the 75th anniversary of that. And as associate dean, I figured I had some other duties as well, and we can talk about them, because I was trying to explain to the staff at the Graham School the significance of what they had, and the significance of what the broader Great Books movement meant. And so really, I've been looking at this since the late 1980s. And one of the things I found myself in supervising this basic program, the Great Books program, was I figured how best to supervise than to go through it. And so I decided to go through it. So 3 nights or 3 hours a week for 4 years, myself and a group of colleagues, about 12 of us, got together, 3 hours under the supervision of a sort of a facilitator, not a lecturer, but one who facilitated the conversation. That's sort of in brief. And one of the things, to sort of go back, when I was in graduate school, I knew about the Great Books program, and I decided to apply to become one of the instructors. And I was kind of daunted by that task. And I can tell you a little bit about the training programs for the instructors there.
Wonderful.
But go ahead.
Yeah. Well, let's start at the beginning. Let's
Okay.
start at the beginning of the Great Book. So what is the vision behind the Great Books movement?
that it's interesting because there's somewhat of a contemporary question about the great books and when it began and some of its purposes. But I'm going to give you part of the origins, and some of it comes out of Columbia University, especially a class that Professor John Erskine did after the First World War called General Honors, or an honors course. And there it was a focus on collection of books that he put together. And so the idea of great books comes out of there. I could suggest, and there's some recent historiography has pushed it back into a much longer tradition. But the current sort of vision of what the great books are can be said to come out of John Erskine's class. And Mortimer Adler was one of the students there, and then one of the instructors. And so in the 1920s, you really have that movement starting first at Columbia, and there's a continuation afterwards. When he actually, Mortimer Adler met then Yale Law School Dean, Robert Maynard Hutchins, and they developed a relationship. And when Hutchins goes out to the University of Chicago in 1929 at the youngest, actually 1930, the youngest professor. He was really only 29 years old at that point. And so one of the things he realized working with Adler is that he didn't see himself as educated. He had never learned to read really effectively until he got to law school. And when he discovered that, well, legal court decisions are hardly great books, and he kind of realized that. But one of the things that he did as president of the University of Chicago is he started a freshman honor seminar that he taught with Mortimer Adler, and he did it for his entire presidency. So that is part of the start of the great books movement in the United States. You could go back you could go back to the first decade of the 20th century, where the president of Harvard sort of quipped that he could teach or someone could develop a liberal education by reading a set of books that were 5 feet long, the so-called 5-foot shelf. And I've always said that you can get a Harvard education in 15 minutes for free, but you can't get a University of Chicago education in 15 minutes a day. So that's something that there is a bit of difference. But looking at that 5-foot shelf, it's not a very systematic approach. And a great books vision that Adler and Hutchins put together was a very carefully curated approach on some of the classic texts in the history of the West. They will develop this vision of the great conversation, but I want to sort of open it up for some follow-up before we get into what that metaphor is, that metaphor of the great conversation.
Sure. So you talked about the background of kind of leading up to this, but it's, Adler and Hutchins who kind of carry this forward in terms of kind of formulating the set of books and kind of choice of books, the range of topics covered, and then kind of culminating into coming up with this centopicon. So let's talk about their creation of the great books.
Okay, well, I'm a historian, so I look in historical terms and sort of see how ideas develop, and that's going to be something that I think that part of the story is important because the great books movement as a curricular project develops in a few very clear paths. And I think part of that is important to really think about, because one of the Hutchins and Adler, especially Hutchins, President Hutchins, then at the University of Chicago, tries a dramatic curricular reform to change undergraduate curriculum at the University of Chicago, centered around great books. That was his goal, and he wasn't fully able to do that. The faculty, in many ways, sort of pushed back significantly. Some of it is faculty always gets bent out of shape about a dynamic administrator, a dynamic president. And clearly, Hutchins was one of the most important university presidents in the entire 20th century. But the faculty pushed back at him. And it's interesting that Hutchins, with a few of his colleagues, realized that he couldn't do a complete curricular change at Chicago centered around the great books. And so actually two of his colleagues at Chicago that he had brought in left to redo the curriculum at St. John's College out in Annapolis and make that a completely great books college that's there. And what Hutchins did after he became somewhat defeated by the faculty, he had some significant faculty allies, but he wasn't able to get the Great Books program through the faculty senate fully. And so what he did is they spun off St. John's. Then what Hutchins decided to do is teach the trustees, the University of Chicago trustees, and other businessmen within downtown Chicago, using that same discussion method that he had pioneered with freshmen in the freshman honor seminar with him and Adler. And then after the Second World War, decided to make it as a curriculum for the returning GIs and others as a great book-centered education. And then after that, they spun off the Great Books Foundation. And then one of Hutchins' vice presidents, William Benton, later a senator, he had made a lot of money. And this is probably more than you need, but if ever you go into an elevator and hear the Muzak, right? William Benton is the guy who invented the Muzak, all right? And he made quite a bit of money, and he decided to buy the Encyclopedia Britannica and bring it to the University of Chicago. And that's how Hutchins and Adler, with Benton, bankrolling part of it, decided to put together the Great Books of the Western World. That's that large series. And yeah, Sherkan knows. And what Adler decided to do is to develop an index of the great ideas, and that is the Syntopicon. And we could talk a little bit further about how that is. But as the Great Books of the Western World develop, and I've got, if you're interested, I could share real quickly a screen,
Please.
if that's all right.
Please.
Here's Adler. He always liked to smoke a pipe. I actually thought about smoking a pipe once to look like Mortimer Adler. But here's Hutchins himself, and here's that Great Books of the Western World. And that's published in 1952. And the first two volumes right here is the Syntopicon, the index to the great ideas. And the first volume, which Hutchins is holding in his hand, is called The Great Conversation. And here is an image. And so the vision of what the Great Books is a coherent curricular program centered around the great ideas as expressed in that metaphor of the great conversation as the substance of a liberal education. So that's a short version historically to at least bring about some of the how these ideas developed and were implemented, both as a curriculum in a university setting for undergraduates. But what I think is more significant is that they become an adult education curriculum for lifelong learners. That's the idea. The idea is not that you read for 4 years and then you never touch a book in your life, but instead this becomes the basis for a lifelong education in the great books. And that's something that I think is essential to think about. Is something that's not something that you stop with, but rather you keep going.
Wonderful. So let's talk about the first 3 volumes there. So first about the concept of great conversation, because I think that's a magnificent concept, and which really did not, which people are not really familiar with. So what is great conversation?
That's actually a fascinating metaphor, and I could give you some background, but it's really invented as a phrase in 1946. I did some work on this, trying to figure out when the phrase came in. And Mortimer Adler publishes a book, a very significant book, called How to Read a Book, The Art of Getting a Liberal Education. And he publishes that in 1940, and it becomes a bestseller. In there, he talks about what it means to have great books. And I'll get back to this a little bit later in the discussion. But he never uses the expression, the great conversation. When he puts together a training manual for those who will be teaching in the Great Books program for adults, that's the first time he uses the phrase. And I want us to sort of explain what that means, because oftentimes when we look at great books, we think of this sort of wall of texts that are very intimidating. As someone said, a classic is someone who is a book that someone wanted to have read or thought you should read, but you never do. That's part of the problem with that. They're kind of distant in some ways. But we can talk about some of the politics of the great books in the West as well, and we'll need to. But one of the things I want to see is that it's not just reading. And here Adler has a number of quips, but one of his favorites, or one of my favorites, Adler said, reading alone is as dangerous as drinking alone, which I sometimes reflect, but if you're actually reading something, you are in dialogue with the author. So maybe we can get away from that. But what does this mean? What does the great conversation mean as a metaphor, as well as a method? So we could take a look at Hutchins's framing of that, and then I can go back to the original of what Adler describes it. But the tradition of the West, according to Hutchins and Adler, is embodied in the great conversation, which began at the dawn of history and continues to the present day. The goal toward which Western society moves is the civilization of the dialogue. The spirit of Western civilization is the spirit of inquiry. And this is, I'm reading from Hutchins's text, The Great Conversation. The spirit of Western civilization is the spirit of inquiry. The dominant element is the logos. Nothing is to remain undiscussed. Everybody is to speak his mind. No proposition is to be left unexamined. The exchange of ideas is held to be the path to the realization of the potentialities of the human race. That's sort of this vision. The Great Conversation, as a civilization around specific ideas, a civilization of the dialogue. And one of the things that is kind of a metaphor that we use at the University of Chicago, and this is something that's kept, which I think is very important. But oftentimes you will look at education and you envision a lecture. You envision a group of people sitting there listening to somebody speak. Right? That's not how they did it at Chicago, and that's still not how they do it. Let me show you a picture. This is from 1945. This is the freshman honor seminar right here, and Mortimer Adler is at the top of the table. This is Milton Mayer, who's kind of the assistant of Robert Maynard Hutchins. It was July of 1945, and the University of Chicago was the one who had organized and was running the Manhattan Project. And so this week, Robert Maynard Hutchins was not able to be at the table with Adler. But you get the sense of what the table means. There, everybody is able to participate. And to give you a little bit of sort of pedagogical background, when they were doing or sort of setting up this educational program, they decided to separate out the examination portion from the discussions. And so it was a separate faculty or grading staff who would grade the examinations of the students. And so the students were able to talk back to the professors without fear of reprisals in their gradebook. And so this enabled this incredible spirit of inquiry at the table that's there. And so if you look at the vision of what the Great Conversation is, it is not passive groups of students listening to an instructor, but rather everyone equal around the table, all sharing the same text, reading it closely and learning, guided by the instructor, Adler and Hutchins in this case. But rather they're the ones coming in and able to participate. Right? They learn to basically listen in to this 2,500-year-old dialogue that will take place in the tradition of the history of the West, people engaging authors, et cetera, but also learning to be able to understand it, but then to contribute to themselves.
Wow. I mean, another way in which I think about the Great Conversation is that it is actually inviting all the great thinkers in every field to that table. So some of you are here in the present and you're reading and you're actually inviting, just like you're saying that when you're reading a book, you're having a dialogue with the author. In this great conversation, you are inviting all these people and having a dialogue with all the great thinkers as if they were equal. And just one-on-one, what do you think? And what did Newton think about this? And how did Aristotle think about this? And put it all together. So I think it's a profound idea. And I think the next two volumes do the work of actually implementing it. So of kind of syntopicon. So that is also another profound idea of theirs. So what is a syntopicon?
That is an index of 102 great ideas. And what I'm not sure I have a photo immediately, but maybe after the break I can find one. But there's this fabulous image because what Adler does is it costs a significant amount of money. I think he took about $1 million to put this together, which in the 1940s is real money at that time. And what he did is he hired a group of University of Chicago graduate students. And what they did is physically read through all of the volumes that would become the great books of the Western world and index them based on these ideas, based on these 102 great ideas. And it's fascinating to sort of see this vision, but also the hard work that puts together that hadn't been done before. Individual authors will do their own indices, but no one had sort of taken a look at the entirety of the text of the Western tradition, trying to see where the ideas were there. And these were Adler's. Adler put together these 102 ideas. And I'm sort of taking a look at it. I know you can't see it, but in the covers of the Syntopicon has not only all the great books of the Western world. There's upwards of 54 different volumes of it, although sometimes they call Shakespeare one, and sort of all of Shakespeare is included in there. But the great ideas are everything from angel to world, with questions of wisdom or science or sin or slavery or oligarchy or the one and the many. Many of them are philosophical, many of them are political, but also some significant religious ideas. But what these graduate students put together and other indices are the texts that become the Syntopicon. And then what Adler does is he took 4 years off of writing anything else. And what he did is write introductions to each of those, focusing on those ideas. So it's very much a collaborative project that's present in compiling these two volumes. But one of the things that Adler insisted upon, and the board, the board of directors of the Encyclopedia Britannica backed him, is that Adler insisted that you had to have a way through these texts. You had to have an index, because otherwise, as Hutchins described it, it's just a bunch of intellectual furniture that would be in your living room. But instead, this gives you the means, the method by which you can work your way through them on specific ideas. And so it's really two ways to examine these great books. One is to read them topically or sequentially, chronologically, say, starting with Homer and then going all the way up to Freud at that point. A second, though, and this is what Adler really encouraged people to do and develop this tool, which he thought was essential to this book set, was enable you to follow a specific idea through that 2,500-year great conversation. So sort of two parts to that, but the Syntopicon was absolutely critical to the significance of what the great books of the Western world are and how you can use them in the present.
Wonderful. And those essays on each of those ideas are masterpieces, because they actually achieve so much. It's a kind of writing I'd never seen before, because what you're trying to do is, let's take the idea of, I want to give one example. Let's take the idea of change. So what Adler does in this essay is that he will talk about how did physics deal with change, including how it was critical for Galileo to be able to measure time properly in order to deal with change? How did Newton build on it with calculus, which actually, solved many of the problems that people have had with change? Then you look at Darwin and saying, before Darwin, everybody thought that life was static, that species were static. The idea that there is change in biology, massive change over a long period of time, and how it connects to the inspiration from geology that Lyell provided, that everyday events that we see, given enough time, makes this massive change. How does psychological change happen? What does William James, Freud have to say about that? How does social change happen? What do Marx and other folks have to say about that? What is philosophy of change? What is the battle between the Parmenides and Heraclitus, and how did Plato and Aristotle take over? And it just does all of that in about 8 to 10 pages on idea after idea. And they are very careful to do justice to each of these thinkers. They are saying things in the way in which the thinker would say, yes, this is a fair description of what I thought. And they are laying it all out for you. In addition to that, they have a summary of all the issues that have been covered regarding that idea, and they have references into that giant intellectual furniture that we're talking about. So you could dive in, you say, Aquinas has something really interesting things to say about beauty. Oh, it is here on this page. You just go look that up. And you use that as a base to access the entire of this great conversation across all fields, across all times. So those are remarkable, remarkable essays.
And Adler wrote them all. That's all Adler. He doesn't have any additional people that are there. I was fascinated when I first learned about you starting up this meetup group, because I hadn't seen anybody kind of work their way through. Each of the ideas and the way you had centered around that meetup. I did hear a couple individuals. I've actually heard a couple of anecdotes. There was a Episcopal minister who basically used them as the basis for his sermons week by week. He would just pull up one text, one of the great ideas, and go week by week after that. But after 102 weeks, I had to come up with another method of putting his sermons together. But yes, they're marvelous little short essays. But the significance of it is it brings you into the primary source texts. But it does set up that conversation one with another on the same idea. And that's something that really nobody had done that before. That's not a method of teaching that people were used to, or a method of putting together the text. When Charles Eliot, that's who the Harvard president, puts together the 5-foot shelf, he's not thinking of ways in which you can have this as a systematic education, tracking an idea through the centuries. Instead, he wants to just kind of pick and choose and do the kind of 15 minutes a day, which is not something that's conducive to a liberal education, which is a lifelong project.
Wonderful. So what happens to this Great Books Project next in terms of how, they have now created these great books, they have the great conversation idea, they have the Syntopicon, they have the entire set. What do they do with it?
Well, there's a couple of things, and I want to go back in the broader vision first, or actually second. First thing is, what do they do with it? It becomes like the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's something that you sell. And what the Britannica company does is have a bunch of door-to-door salesmen selling the great books of the Western world. A friend of mine actually wrote a book on that, on the marketing process. And it was just an amazing process in the 1950s into the 1960s that you would actually go to door, and a couple of years they sold over 100,000 of these sets. Year after year to people. So it's kind of fascinating. One of the things, though, that Hutchins and Adler did not want this merely to be furniture in somebody's living room, although oftentimes that came in, you could actually buy the bookcase that you'd fit them all in, that it was a nice, wood color that you can put, under the, next to the fireplace. But what they tried to do is to develop great books reading groups. And this becomes a significant movement in the late 40s throughout the mid 1950s around these texts that you would have them. And there were upwards of 50,000 people in the United States doing these in small group settings throughout the United States. And that's the kind of practical way of continuing people's liberal education, that was what the great books were envisioned as. Now, there's a couple other things as to go back to the main question, that first point, is that this vision of the West, the great books of the Western world, that's what they had put together in that 54 volume set. And there, Hutchins is very explicit in that first volume, The Great Conversation. What he's trying to do is say, we have put together the great books of the Western world. We are not qualified to put together the books of the Eastern world. Someone else can do that. And then when that has been done, we could come together and have the great books of the world. That was the original vision. What a friend of mine who wrote one of the books on Adler called Great Books Cosmopolitanism. That's what he described it as. And so the envision of this is not strictly a Western tradition, but rather one that would be West to East. And the Graham School, actually, the University of Chicago Graham School, actually tried to implement that in really about 15 years ago, where we did have what's called the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults, which the core, that's that 4-year, 360-hour program that is focused around the great books. That's the 3 hours a week for 30 weeks a year. We had developed a parallel called the Eastern Classics and taught that for a number of years, and had individuals going through that as well. But there was some little sort of conceptual difficulty. We use University of Chicago faculty to put that together, as well as experts in adult education. But in the West, you can use the metaphor of the Great Conversation, a 2,500-year dialogue that sort of shapes that of ideas. But if you go to the East, and we'll explain what the East is, it's not the same kind of single tradition. And so as they put together that Eastern classics, they had 1 year on the texts of China, another year on the texts of India, another year on the texts of Japan, and another year on the texts of the Islamic world. And yes, they interact somewhat, but the Chinese tradition, for example, is a tradition in and of itself that doesn't have the kind of interaction that, for example, Greece does with Rome, with Berlin, with London, even with Philadelphia. And so that's a much more, the West is has that vision of the Great Conversation. In the East, not so much. East are, in many ways, separate traditions. And so that was a conceptual issue that's there. We can talk about some other things, but that wasn't as successful. But the bigger issue is that at the beginning, when Hutchins and Adler are putting together this educational program, they don't see it as strictly in the West. That's what they know. That's their own tradition. That's their own civilization. But they understand that this should be a basis of a world culture and a world community. So that part of that project is still to be fully implemented.
Wonderful. I also noticed that when I was reading the Syntopicon or just writings of these gentlemen, they were very careful about specifying their limits, both in terms of space and time. So for example, they were saying, look, it's difficult to judge anybody who is too close to your time. So we're going to stop at Freud. That's our cutoff. And that's why it is the cutoff. But within that time frame, we're going to cover everything. China and India are worlds in themselves, which are very different. We don't have expertise right now to be able to, we hope somebody else does it, but we are going to focus on that. So I really appreciate that, of just kind of delimitation of what they know, and knowing that there is this other universes that you need to take in as well in order to do that.
And some of it is when they put together that list of great books that they had. They're doing this in the 1950s. Really 1950, 51, it's published in 52. And they go back, the latest text in the series, in the sequence, is, I believe it's 1911. So it's about 40 years earlier. And so one of the things that I was sort of pushing as Associate Dean at UChicago Graham is to try to get the staff to think about, well, now when I started, it was 2015. Let's pick that as a year. 40 years prior to 2015, when is that? Why don't we go up at least through, 1970, and then we can sort of bring in some contemporary literature or something that is somewhat contemporary. But there was resistance to that, and so most of the texts still studied at Graham really stop at 1920 or so. That's about the latest, and so that's something we want to think about as to what are the criteria that makes a great book. And so one of the things that Adler and Hutchins were very clear on, they didn't want this to be an antiquarian project. It's not historical. The reason you read Homer is not because the Greeks did, but rather that Homer has something to say to our own times, or Aristotle has something to say to our own times. And it's a very contemporary approach, one that is not reading the great books for great books' sake, but rather to help them to illuminate the issues, the problems, the struggles that we're facing now. And Hutchins and Adler were very clear about that, in the fact that they didn't see that this is really a project for someone's leisure, but rather it was an essential to build the responses to the crisis that they found themselves in the 1940s and the 1950s. Remember, when this curricular reform starts at the University of Chicago, this is the Great Depression. They're watching the rise of communism in Russia, of fascism in Italy, of Nazism in Germany. When the books are published, the great books of the Western world in 1952, that's in the middle of the Cold War. And so they really understand that these are the answers to these contemporary challenges are present in this dialogues, in the dialogue over 2,500 years. So that's something that's really present as why they're doing this, part of that purpose. And it's interesting because this is also when India is becoming independent. China is going through its revolution, trying to understand itself as well as the broader Confucian tradition, combined with the modernization program that Marxism brings in. And so you have this ferment, the possibility of one world. And it's very much that, yeah, maybe not utopian, but a very clear vision of what a world community can be. And that should be based on common texts, first in the West and then globally.
Wonderful. Fred, I want to tell you about our experience at our meetups, because we've done more than 60 meetups on these ideas. Regarding this particular point about this not being a historical exercise or archaeological exercise, but something that is extremely useful and critical in for today. So what I ended up doing is that I took these essays, reread them, and tried to boil them down to crucial questions that all these folks had asked over all these years, just the questions. And I would lead the meetup with the questions. So I would provide the questions to people beforehand. Now, about a quarter of the people would actually be reading the essays with us, but 3/4 would not be reading the essays. And then during the meetup, I would raise the questions and talk about the wide variety of answers that different thinkers had presented. Now, something remarkable happened. We're doing this in New York. Something like 30 to 80 people would show up every Saturday to discuss these ideas. And these are New Yorkers. So they're from all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of countries, all kinds of ages, all kinds of fields. And the great thing about these ideas is these are the ideas that are vital to thinking and operating. So anybody who is a thoughtful person, even though they had never heard of great books, would actually have lots of things to say about those questions. And they were very eager to. So what we would do is that I would put these things on the table, just like this format. Initially, we would put these things on the table, then we would break it up into small groups and we would discuss. And then we would come back and everybody would talk about what are they walking away with? What did they learn about that idea today? And it worked beautifully in spite of the fact that 75% of people did not actually read the thing, because these ideas are not ideas of the past, but these are the ideas that people are living with. So that's so for me, it's like it's a strong proof that this is something that is not only needed, but is something that actually people, once if you can present it to people in a way where they can actually interact with it, it can be very, very powerful.
Because it is contemporary. These are ideas that we face now. One of the things that I keep going back to, especially in the time right now, we're dealing with a very polarized time of trying to figure out what democracy means, for example. As I go back, and this is when I'm talking about some of my students, I'll actually pull out reading, but I go back to Thucydides and his history of the Peloponnesian War, and especially the revolt at Corcyra, between the few and the many, or between the oligarchic party and the democratic party, and how that breaks down into civil war within Corcyra, and that civil war spreads throughout many of the rest of the Greek polis. And so to try to think with Thucydides how to avoid that process of the disintegration of a political community or a body politic into civil war between the few and the many. That's one sort of practical question, is to try to see how do you resolve that polarization. And the Great Books has resources there within that broader great conversation, because that is a topic that is a constant. How do we govern ourselves? And so that is one that we all have skin in the game, as it were, in trying to understand that. So yes, very, very helpful.
So what happened to the Great Books Project? Because there was a time where there were all these Great Books clubs. There was a lot of activity. What has happened to it kind of across the country? What has happened to it at University of Chicago?
A very good question. A couple things. One of the things that Hutchins and Adler had set up was the Great Books Foundation to manage and run these Great Books reading groups. That was developed, I believe, in 1947, and using some money from the University of Chicago. It still exists, the Great Books Foundation, but I think it was 1962, they shifted their orientation away from the historical texts and moved it very much up to almost the present. So they dropped most of the material written prior to the 19th century. They'll do some, but then they will put in much more 20th century and sometimes really more of the recent past. And so they kind of drop out the notion of that 2,500-year great conversation. So it's a little more narrow in that direction. Some of it is an American approach to this. Americans don't really like to read so much, but also the focus upon the new, rather than to be able to learn from the past. Americans are a small p progressive kind of people. And I mean, Alexis de Tocqueville, the author of one of the great books on democracy in America back in the 1830s, realized that the American, as equipped, the American is a kind of a person who buys a house to retire in and sell it before the roof is on. They're very clearly focused on the present, and that which is the most new, the most innovative, is what really drives Americans. And a lot of it is the 1960s, a tense emphasis upon the contemporary rather than to learn from the past and to engage with the past. And so there's a very presentist orientation the Americans have. We could come back into some ideological opposition to the great books. And that was where it becomes very significant, especially in the 1980s with the debate at Stanford University over Western civilization as a curriculum. With Jesse Jackson, maybe not leading the charge, but participating in the march of hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. You've lost the texts and the sense of what the history of the West means as something that's coherent. And so to go back to my own little background, once I graduated from university and started my first teaching job, I realized I really needed to understand the history of the West. And so I taught a required course. The first teaching that I had was a required course in the history of Western civilization. And I taught that for a number of years. And I would bring in many of the great books of the Western world and have the students read through them. There used to be requirements at most universities. This is generally in the 20th century, up until really the 1970s, 1980s. But when I started teaching in the early 90s, I was at a small liberal arts college that did still have a required year-long sequence in Western Civ. And so I got that training. I learned how to do that as a teaching assistant in graduate school at the University of Chicago because I taught as an assistant in Western Civ, and I carried that over into the beginning of my own teaching career. But hardly any other university now offers a required sequence in the history of Western civilization. That is something that universities pulled back from very significantly since that Stanford debate in the late 1980s. And it was fascinating to look at this. And there was an ideological push to eliminate Western Civ as a requirement. But about 5 years ago, students at Stanford, a group of students at Stanford, petitioned the university, and they actually got it on the ballot, the student government ballot, to bring back Western Civ as a requirement. Mm-hmm. And it was fascinating to look at this debate because here you had the opposition to it was so critical, saying that this encourages Western imperialism, et cetera, a Western chauvinism and a triumphalism. Those were debate arguments back from the 1980s, and they were continuing those. But the students in 2016 were saying, no, that's not it at all. What we really need is something in common that all of us have read together. And that's what, and since we are of the West, let's do that, not as a chauvinistic or triumphalistic approach, but rather to create a common community in opposition to the fragmentation of the undergraduate curriculum. Unfortunately, that failed the vote, and now it's still the fractured curriculum. But at most universities, that requirement of Western civilization has disappeared. And it's been replaced by kind of a pick and choose from a variety of civilizations you can do. At University of Chicago, I think you can do upwards of like 10 different requirements to meet this. It's actually a 2-quarter requirement for undergraduates. So the notion of how you teach the history of the West, whether through a textual approach like the great books, or whether through a historical approach like Western Civ, that's no longer at almost every major university. That's no longer a requirement.
Wow. Now, let me ask a very tough question. I personally see this as a base, the great books as a base. You kind of have to have that under your feet, because actually that is what is supporting you. There is all of that. So you need to have, but you can't, it has to be a base. It can't be, you can't just stick to that. You have to launch into the future with that as a base. And there are still critical things that are missing. Like, for example, East is a very clear example, right? You can't really understand the world without understanding, I would say, China and India. You need to at least take that in. And those civilizations are complex. I mean, they are as rich, they've been around for a very long time, and they have a considerable amount of richness. Their manner of operation is very different. So the same tools that you use, or maybe even the same people, cannot easily access it. So that's one thing. The things are moving very fast. So you have to be able to integrate everything that you need to integrate into your mind in order to operate very well. So if you wanted to just think wildly or saying, okay, what would it take to, what other elements are needed and what is really needed to be using this as a part of your base in the future? What do you think of? What is needed?
Well, if you take a look at the world as a whole, and what you need to be educated, to really engage with the variety of challenges that we have to face in this 21st century. We're Westerners, and I'm pushing that because we're all doing this in English. We all have a culture based on the alphabet. We have one that interacts over these 2,500 years or so with some common ideas and common principles. If we don't know those at a base, we really have a hard time understanding who we are as people who come out of this Western tradition. The kind of quip I like to do is, what happens when, like you had in a Massachusetts high school this last year, a English teacher excited because she got rid of Homer's Odyssey from the high school curriculum. And so here are these kids who are going to come up through high school not knowing the meaning of the minivan they drive in. So that's kind of a basic sense, right? You've got to know these terms. You have to know the significance of what Athens, Jerusalem, Rome, Paris, Philadelphia, what these cities mean in the history of who we are. The next step is to understand the civilizations that we've been interacting with, of India and China, as two very different notions of the East. There are others as well, but you can't read everything. And so you have to make, in some ways, a selection. But looking at how different India and that centuries-long, millennia-long tradition, as well as with China. And then I would think that we need to really engage in some of the things, maybe a different way of thinking. I see a friend here, and I'm sure you've discussed questions of the digital environment.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at what a digital challenge is to the history of the West, to the East, but also as you look towards the future. And so there, in many ways, the purpose of what Adler and Hutchins were trying to do is to create a community based on common texts, a common language, and a common conversation. And they very clearly knew that the next phase was to engage with India and China, particularly. And then they would look now, I would see that they would see a digital challenge. And why do I use that? One of the things in the West from our tradition, one of the earliest things is a oral text that has emerged in the Hebrew Bible, the Tower of Babel narrative. And if you remember that Tower of Babel narrative, or if you haven't had a chance to look at it, it's really only about 11 or so verses. It's short in Genesis 11. But it's clearly, it sort of starts out, the world had one language. And then if you remember the story, this one language enables them to create this tower that reaches up to heaven. And God in the text sort of comes down and changes their language, or makes their language sort of different. And so they lead off building the tower. Well, if you examine that closely and sort of walk their way through, who is going to keep a narrative like that? It's not going to be the builders of the tower. It's not the architects or the king who established these great ziggurats. Instead, if you look closely as what is preserved, it's the people who have to build the stupid tower. It's not the pyramid, right, that is designed to enshrine the memory of the pharaoh for all time. It's instead the slaves who had to mix the mortar and dry the bricks. And so it's a liberation narrative as we think about it, of freedom of the slave, so that the tower no longer is being built by an oppressed class. We have one language. Well, if you look now, what you're seeing in a situation in the future, or the present rather, you do have a single world language. It's binary code. That's how it's written. And so if you don't know that, or at least don't know that, situations in time where you had a class that had the monopoly of speech or of writing, all of a sudden you can find yourselves without the tools to navigate the present. And then you go look back at that tradition within the West, or within China as well, to understand how do you develop a way that you can actually be independent. So that's one example as you look towards the future. But yeah, Hutchins and Adler had a program back in the 1950s. We'll understand the West, then we can understand the East. We're not qualified. We have to be students that way. And then we can actually develop that one world community with things in common.
Wonderful. Fred, I have so many questions for you, but let's do one thing. There are lots of great people on this call. So let's now go to the breakout rooms for about 20 minutes so we can have a much more kind of interactive discussion. And then, folks, when you come back, try to come up with your takeaways. What did you learn from? Just very brief, maybe one, and you're welcome to ask a question, the biggest question that you have left. So this breakout room will allow us to kind of step back, look at this, discuss it, and come back again. So I'm starting the breakout rooms now. They will run for 20 minutes, and then we'll be automatically back here. In the breakout rooms, let everybody talk for about a couple of minutes so that you get all the thoughts on the table, so you can have a really good discussion. Keep on topic, be brief, be courteous, feel free to disagree, but do so courteously. All right, starting the breakout rooms now.
Thank you, Shrikant, and thank you, Fred. This is fantastic. I really enjoyed the opportunity to have you go through all of this. Fred is working, by the way, with some of us on something called Trivium University. And so that's a part of the reason why I want to ask the question this way. You did an excellent job, Fred, of laying out how Great Books was a globalist project. And as we all know, globalism is now dead. As indeed you described, so is Great Books. So since Great Books cannot continue as a globalist project, since globalism is finished, what would you like to say about what we replace it with now that we're no longer in a one world configuration, which was Hutchins' goal, and clearly he failed? You're muted, Fred, also. Sorry.
Yep, sorry about that, I'm muted. We were talking a little bit in our breakaway session about some of the background that was there, that we didn't fill in some of the stories to see how much of this, as you describe it, as a globalist project. And one of the key figures behind the Great Books movement at the University of Chicago was a philosopher, I just blanked on his name, Richard Mckeon was his name. If you know Mckeon, he's the one who does the student version of the basic works of Aristotle. But Richard Mckeon was instrumental in developing the philosophical framework to the United Nations and UNESCO's Universal Declaration on Human Rights. That's a very clear understanding of maybe not globalist, but a universal sense of what the notion of the human is and human dignity. Some of that is not dead, it's aspirational, put it that way, but it's not universally seen as something that's valid, especially as you look at a few of the things that have been coming out of topics of the Communist Party in China. One of the things is, as you do see this fragmentation of the world into a West and then an East that see themselves increasingly at odds with one another, that globalist vision is really in serious, I'm not quite sure it's fully dead, but it's on life support. Let us put it that way. And to look at what the future will be is I really was thinking that yeah, if you have a single world language that gives you that return to what the Tower of Babel was like, not of different languages, but rather a central ruling oligarchy. And there, what you'd need is part of the tradition, the various traditions, but especially some of the tradition of the West, to resist some of that development into a new oligarchy, technological oligarchy. That doesn't fully answer your question. But if you want to do a follow-up or open it up to somebody else to, as you articulate what this vision is, East, West, and digital, as we can sort of, I'm sure we've talked about it before, and many of us have within Shirkan's meetup group.
Wonderful, folks. If you have questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat. Mark with a C. You need to unmute yourself, Mark.
Fred, it's very interesting what you just said. I really appreciate your introduction, your whole presentation. And I actually have the Synopticon and the great books. I haven't really read them all, but I bought them in a library sale, and I know it's a great, endeavor, a great work. Now, when I was speaking with Mark Stahl, he was saying as he questioned you, the globalization project is dead. I said, well, does it really have to be? And I think your answer is in the spirit that I was thinking, that even though it can't be used as it might have been intended, it's not something that should be let go of. And he was talking about the Digital Life Center, and I was saying, well, why not have a digital life place that maintains that project, even though it might not be able to be realize its ultimate goal, but it still can have a very positive influence in the world, and it can be adapted and worked on and abstracted. And it's very important to keep these great books and to keep this dialogue going, because it's really the whole essence of civilization, of human civilization. So I don't understand the idea of just like letting it go. I think that's a little bit far-fetched.
I don't think we're trying to let it go or seeing that it's no longer relevant. It may be we're in new conditions that will have to sort of reshape it, rethink it, and maybe reshape some of the content that's present within. One of the things that when you put together a 54-volume sort of wall of books, it gives the impression that this is a canon that is closed. And there was very much a sense that they used the term of a canon, looking at well, if we look back at what the Old and New Testament of the Bible is, or the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, that's very clearly this notion of canon or measure, and the sense that it is closed. Interesting to see that. I like how Hutchins describes this as a civilization of the dialogue. It's something that you wouldn't assume that would be closed, that could continue with this discussion, continue with the conversation. Lectures end. Great books as printed text ends. And there you can kind of see the bookends that are there really clearly. That gives you the sense that this is a closed canon. But if you look at it in the example using the metaphor of the great conversation, there what you do is, well, somebody had raised in our meetup group, say, a challenge of multiculturalism in a woke sense that you throw out the Odyssey. And I say, well, no, what you do is you have to look at the great conversation around the table. And there, what you do is you put another seat in. You give another voice within that table, right? So the conversation becomes broader. You enlarge the circle of the we, as someone said. Maybe it's not this globalist vision, because there may be something that is inherently in opposition to this. Questions of individual human dignity is perceived as globalist by and universal by the individuals who put together the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but there very clearly are elements in the history of humanity that will deny the individual human dignity of other figures, maybe someone who is the they or the outsider or the other. But that's why I like the civility inherent in the metaphor of the great conversation, because there you just bring a bigger table and you add another voice. You don't throw out that conversation that had been taking place for 2,500 years, but instead you sometimes add a new voice. Yes, you need to see it as an open-ended dialogue. The civilization of the dialogue is like that. So yeah, I think Mark, that's with a C, that's been very helpful. I don't want to give up reading Aristotle or giving up reading Aquinas or Plato or Marx even. They're voices that as you develop, and really the great conversation is a method. It's not something you and one person like me reading Aristotle trying to figure that out, but rather like this meetup group. So it's very nice. The Zoom is a nice metaphor of the table. You can always add another little box that's there, which is just marvelous of how you look at it, even though physically not separate. Rupali is one of the people who was in our meetup group, and she described how she's using the great books to teach her middle school kids, but also she's in Massachusetts, but also they're zooming in from India, reading the same texts together and engaging this from their different perspectives and their different life experiences as they engage classic texts. So I think that's a really, a fabulous experience of what certain technology enables us to do. But yeah, you've added significantly more seats at the table.
Thank you. Next up is Kevin. Kevin, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. To simplify the civil dialogue, I understand it. Western culture, East culture is one corner of two sides. It's it's great to hear you. The great objective for the great book of the Western world is to unify the 21 great books. That's all alone that makes sense for everyone. My question is about 道德经. I heard when I do a little bit of Google search, I find it's in the Chicago University. What's the status now? Anything like a new or update? Thank you.
Oh, the status at the University of Chicago. It's the great books are only in a few of the undergraduate courses. The method of inquiry around the table is there. That still is there, and Chicago students are a traditionally feisty lot, which I'm glad they continue of challenging the professors. But a common curriculum like the great books is not there in the undergraduate curriculum. What there is for adult education. There is what's called the Basic Program of Liberal Education for Adults. That's the full title that the University of Chicago Graham School does. And that is a curricular program that is consistent with what Adler and Hutchins have put together. So that there's been thousands of people go through it. At this point, they've moved it online. And so people go through it cohorts, starting with year one in the autumn quarter, going to the spring, and they work their way through for 4 years. And at the end, it's a certificate program. And so you receive a certificate in liberal education from there. It's not a credit, but you are, well, then you get to be an alum of the University of Chicago with all the privileges and everything else, meaning that the University of Chicago asks you for money. But you don't need to do that necessarily. But it's a much more inexpensive program than a graduate course. So that's one of the things that the University of Chicago is still doing. And they've done it online, and it's been fascinating to watch cohorts of people work through together now with this online program. I've had students in Germany and Chile, in most of the states in the United States, all working together, looking at the same text. So it's still possible to do it. It's called the Basic Program of Liberal Education. And you can just Google that, or I can have Shrikant put it up, or I'll try to put it up in the chat. So.
There was one part of his question, Kevin's question, where he was asking whether University of Chicago is looking at Chinese classics like Tao Te Ching.
Oh, that specific question. I'm sorry, I missed that. Very good question. One of the things the University of Chicago does has a very robust program in East Asian languages, East Asian civilizations, and South Asian civilizations. So it is possible that for an undergraduate, you can do your civilization requirement by looking at East Asian Chinese civilization and having a year-long sequence in that and go very deeply in depth, or in South Asian civilization. So that is something that the University of Chicago does using the method it pioneered with its Western civilization course, started in 1947 with Bill McNeil. They've expanded that, and now a University of Chicago student as an undergraduate has to do a civilization sequence, but you can do it in East Asia, or you can do it in South Asia, or you can do it in European civilization or the old Western Civ course too. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Eileen, Mark Stallman, and Mark H. Eileen, go ahead.
Thank you, Shrikant. And Fred, I think you are a terrific guest here. Fred, what I wanted to ask is there a program for youth at risk? Is there great books offered to them in any way, and how do they access it? And could you tell us a little about the summer programs for children and youth? And thank you so much.
Okay, that's a very good question, and how you expand this to make it accessible. And that's one of the challenges if you look at this, because great books, you do have to make them being accessible to a much larger percentage of the population. The University of Chicago itself does not do it outside the undergraduate body. It does have a few charter schools, but that's charter schools that are restricted mission in some ways, and they're just in Chicago. There are a few outside groups that do Great Books Likes programs. There is a Great Books program that runs through Chicago, but the University of Chicago doesn't operate that. That's a private commercial organization that does it in the summer. And that's not what the Graham School or what the University of Chicago itself is involved with. So I would have to sort of say that I don't know too much about those. I know the Great Books Foundation does a series, especially they have Rupali, what's it called specifically? It's like the Junior Readers Program.
It's called the Juniors Great Books Program. And the Junior Great Books Program is similarly structured as the Great Books Program. The idea is to use the shared inquiry method. And they have a very good selection of books for youth. That's the program we use from kindergarten up to 8th grade, but I know they also have for older students. It comes with a teacher guide too, so the adults can use the guide to lead the conversation.
Okay, so Great Books Foundation has the Junior Great Books program. U Chicago Graham had pioneered one that reaches out to the city, especially those who are outside, sort of privileged classes. We focus on the South Side and bringing our Great Books approach to the South Side, but that we restrict to adults, those who are over 18. And so that's our restriction there. So I'd have to refer you to the Great Books Foundation and other approaches. So they're extremely important question on how to bring this in. There's a number of other groups who developed this around homeschool curriculum, and this has expanded over the last few years. But there, it's a little more difficult because there you're focusing on the text and the content rather than that broader conversation. And so some very important. So, but I would urge you to look elsewhere because U Chicago really doesn't do that. Yeah, but thank you, Oliver. Very good question.
Thank you. Next up is going to be, thank you. Next up is going to be Mark Stallman, followed by Mark H. Mark.
Thanks again. Fred, you invited me to briefly describe East, West, and Digital, which is the world we live in today. So I'd like your thoughts about whether there can be more seats pulled up to the table under these circumstances. In particular, I'd also like your comments on how technologies shape our understanding of the world, in particular the structures of the world, how we tend to understand structure based upon the technologies that we use to communicate. So East, West, and Digital, very briefly, is logographic, alphabetic, and code as the underlying structure, the language involved. This brings us back to Fred's Tower of Babel. Not only are there multiple languages, but there are multiple grammars, fundamentally different grammars that cannot be made commensurate. And we're already in a situation where the Tower of Babel cannot be resolved. Leibniz, as you know, given the complexities of his situation, attempted to come up with the universal language to address these questions, effectively replacing Latin, which would have been his story. He failed, everybody else has failed. Why do you think there could be, under digital conditions, a universal language, and why could there be a big table to which new chairs can be pulled up?
It's a very good question, and one that I kind of want to push back a little bit and saying, because I don't want to see three different tables that are mutually incommensurable, one with another. One of the things, the possibility of that great book's cosmopolitanism as they're thinking in the mid-20th century to bridge the East and the West. The digital sphere is something that adds something completely new, or not completely new, but a new form of thinking, a new sort of ground as you're describing it, from the alphabet to the ideograph or pictograph, and now binary code. One of the things in the metaphor that I was using with the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel as it's written and preserved is deeply suspicious of the global. Because technology can either go in a centralizing direction or a decentralizing direction, one that increases centralization and authoritarianism. That I think that was what the meaning of the breaking up of the Tower of Babel in that sort of narrative. So one wants to be suspicious of rule by global elites. And there, I think more of a decentralized approach. But I'm concerned about, the vision of having three completely separate tables, rather than add at least. Maybe the idea is you could almost have a representative from one table or another. But I'm fearful that all of a sudden languages, you do in some ways have one now single language, and it's binary, and Chinese is translated into binary code and then translated into English by your Google translator, but it's not Chinese to English. It's that binary code that's there. And so there, I see the vision of preventing that pure centralization under an oligarchic tech authority that only speaks binary. That's something that, at least from the Western tradition, you see as really dangerous to that.
Thank you. Next up is Mark H.
Right. So the notion of whether people who would like to sit at the table of the global conversation or the great conversation, I think there's an interesting paradox, because not everybody would like to sit at the table. So it will never be that everybody sits at the table. It probably never was that everybody sat at the table. Even in the West, it's only, everybody will be influenced. Everybody's influenced by everything else. And intellectual elites are going to have, and philosophers will have more influence. Philosophers and poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. I think, I don't know if Matthew Arnold said that. But the thing is that if enough, I would think that there's certain segments of the world population all over that would still be interested in this conversation. And even though other people wouldn't want to come to the table, there would be a table that wouldn't be completely inclusive. It could be open to all people, but not all people will come. But the fact that that table exists for those that are interested, obviously, I think would have a tremendously positive influence, because it could become a harmonizing influence and a civilizing influence going forward, even though it might be diminished by certain technocratic and vested elite interest. And I think Fred makes the point that the essential point is that the current technology is a double-edged sword, and it's very important. The way I see it is to maintain the liberal tradition and the sharing of ideas globally. And I think it will continue. And one more question, just very short: is there a book that's a schematic, like a cliffside notes of the whole great conversation, something that just underlines, sort of like the Synopticon, but in a much shorter form, and that deals with, let's say, Aristotle, like a cliffside notes of all the great, the key bullet points of all the great philosophers? Because they know when you study philosophy, you can compare the great ideas, but then there's the original text where you see the dialectic and the way the great philosophers achieve their ideas internally, but there's also the way you could just compare the basic conclusions. Is there a text that you would recommend like that to see that what the conversation is in a very schematic form?
To do it in a short version, you can use Robert Maynard Hutchins' The Great Conversation. That's available on the web in a PDF version. That'll give you the idea, and that's really only about 30 pages. That's not that long. One that's pays rereading is Mortimer Adler's How to Read a Book. That's a very good text that he will describe. And actually, he engages in this sort of marvelous dialogue and examples of that. But what it sounded like you're asking is kind of the Cliff Notes version of the various philosophers that are there. And that is probably, I'd send you to Mortimer Adler's The Great Ideas. That's what that Syntopicon is. The Syntopicon takes 2 full volumes, but Adler's Great Ideas, here it is, it's a modern published version. I think it's Bill was saying it's on Kindle for like $16, $18 or somewhere in there. What that is just Adler's essays, the 102 essays on the great ideas. If you go the full thing, the book is about 1,000 pages. If there's 102 essays that are there, it gives you about 8 pages of text on each one. And so that could be a good Cliff Notes version, if you would, for Mark. How's that as a good way? So go back to Adler. Hutchins, The Great Conversation, that's available free on the web. And then Adler's The Great Ideas. Those are all his short versions on everything from angel to wisdom, right at the end, A to W. Probably should have had a Z in there, but he didn't. The animal kingdom is under A.
Next up is Rupali. Rupali, go ahead.
So I don't have so much as a question, but is it okay if I share a quick story?
Just short, yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, so when the pandemic happened and we had to go online, so I ran a school and all of our students and parents were very confused. We actually used the great books, the book that Fred just pointed out, the shortened version, and we would discuss every evening one idea. We started with change. What does it mean, and how people have looked at change through history? And we looked at, the idea of freedom, the idea of education, the idea of leisure versus work. And we were able to come up with our own system of learning during the pandemic by including the parents and students and teachers all together on the same platform. And so I think that the great books are so powerful. The ideas are so powerful today. Even today that, you can learn from what's happened in the past and create your own path forward. Just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Thanks, Rupali. I want to ask one question, Fred, that I meant to ask before. That's about your experience of going through the program at Graham School on the great books and then administering the same program. What was it like? What was it going through it, and what was it like administrating?
it was marvelous to do it as a student, but also one of the unique things, and I think this is very important of how the basic program has developed, notice how no one is trained in the great books in graduate school. This is a generalist program. And it was fascinating because I had the responsibility to approve the hiring of the people who would be the instructors that are there. And there you have the idea of specialization within graduate school, that you focus on a specific topic using a specific method, and you have to write your dissertation, et cetera. But then you're thrown into the Great Books program as an instructor, and no one has that background to be able to teach from Homer to Freud, and including teaching, Newton, little sections on Copernicus. I mean, the range is such incredible. And so it was fascinating to see, can somebody be, yes, the critical thinker, but more significantly, the synthetic thinker? You're trained as the university specialist. And in a graduate program, but also in college major, you're trained to be a specialist. But the basic program in the Great Books itself is you're forced to be the generalist, to be the one who is synthetic, to kind of put ideas together and to make Aristotle talk with Aquinas and to talk with John Locke and try to put together these themes. And so it really stretches you as a student, but also it was fascinating to watch the development of how these Great Books instructors go, because we hired some folk who are brand new, who are their specialists on their own, but also, and this was to me amazing, there have been people who have been teaching in this program for 50 years. 50 years going back and forth. Some of them will specialize on specific texts. Others, though, are forced to teach on deep scientific texts. A friend of mine who I knew before the program is a Hebrew scholar who's fluent in Hebrew, a Christian fellow who studies the Hebrew Bible. But they always gave him Newton's Elements to teach in the basic program, because he was the one who was able to do it. He didn't enjoy it, but he knew how to read and how to apply a close reading method to these texts. And so as someone who's observing this and being able to do it from both sides, it's sort of marvelous to see the discipline that it takes to get people to focus on one text and exclude things outside so that you understand what Plato is saying in the Republic, and understand deeply, and not too quickly bring in your own personal example, but what's on the page. What does Plato actually say, or what does Aristotle actually say? And it develops into this amazing civil conversation. To give you one example, there was this young woman who, her and I used to sit next together in our class. And so we sat together for 4 years. I think I knew she used to be a lawyer. She was renovating her house. And so she had to live with her parents for a while their condo was being renovated. She may have been married, I think. I don't know. So I've sat next to this woman. We talked and shared for 360 hours over 4 years. Don't know too much about her, but I know exactly what she thinks of Socrates. I know exactly what she thinks of Rousseau's ideas. It's just marvelous. Now I have a very close intellectual friend that we share these ideas together. And so immediately when we see each other, we can talk on these texts, even though we may not share all that much in common outside these texts, but we have understood and become intellectual friends. And that will last a lifetime. So it's marvelous about how this approach, and I can do it with the same other figures in the Great Books program. We immediately can pick up these conversations because we have a shared intellectual vocabulary. We're part of this 2,500-year-old great conversation. And we also know its limits. We also realize that there's several traditions that we have to be infants in. Maybe now we're in the deep end of the pool of the West. some of us floundering more than others. But as we approach Eastern texts, Chinese texts, or Indian texts, we're in the baby pool section as we try to struggle to see how, from a completely different technological, meaning not technology like Zoom, but rather technology of the pictograph, of incorporating thoughts, that we have to understand that way. So yes, it's been a marvelous experience, and I encourage people either on their own or in things like the basic program or the Great Books Foundation texts to do it with others, to share mind, to share thinking, not just me trying to understand Hegel, but rather to read it with somebody else or with several people, that we each bring our own experiences to understand that text and then try to apply that. How we're going to use this. And sorry about the dog in the background, but we are at home. Thank you. Yes, I hope that helps, Shrikant.
No, that's absolutely. I mean, that's what we're doing at these meetups with any base that we have. So even like if you look at the conversation over here, what we're doing is that the format remains the same. Everybody either studies something and listens to a presentation. So that's kind of taking everything, and that puts, I think the idea of kind of common knowledge is a huge idea of saying these are the common ideas that you can start talking based on, and then having this interaction in the breakout rooms, and then people kind of coming in and giving their takeaways. And we've been doing it for many thinkers, not just the people in Great Conversation, but there are people like Julian Jaynes, for example. I think he's a seminal thinker where there isn't enough. So we're doing a series of meetups where we are going through all the core ideas, and we are developing just facility to talk about that. So which keeps raising the level of conversation. So Fred, thank you very much. This has been incredibly exciting and educational. So just wonderful to have you here. And I think everybody got a lot of value from everything that you said, and we look forward to continuing this pursuit. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bye everybody. See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.